While dealing with the culturally marked vocabulary, I mean folk lexemes or lexemes of the rustic speech, as they called in different languages, I came across the translations of some Ukrainian folk texts into English. In those texts are the gatherings of the Ukrainian folk tales, folk songs, some proverbs, and so on, of the 19th and the 18th century. The general tendency of such texts, such translations, is that they are is the mixed identity of the Ukrainian language, Ukraine as a state, and Ukrainian cultural concepts in general. For example, in the preface to Kazakh fairy tales and folk tales selected and edited and translated by Nisbet Bain, edited in London in 1890, Ukrainian is identified as the language of Kazakhs. Here's a citation from the preface to that book. The favorable reception given to my volume of Russian fairy tales has encouraged me to follow it up with a sister volume of stories selected from another Slavonic dialect, extraordinarily rich in folk tales. I mean Russenian, the language of the Kazakhs. Russenian is a language intermediate between Russian and Polish, but quite independent of both. So generally, there is a general tendency of assimilating Ukrainian language. There was general tendency of assimilating Ukrainian language with Russian and Polish. That is due, so such argumentation is the example of the complete misidentification of the Ukraine in general as the cultural surrounding as well as its folklore traditional to the European folklorist, as the translations from the Ukrainian were made through Russian or through Polish. Translators, as the representatives of a certain national lingua-cultural communities, must have a cognitive framework that is structured in a certain way of indispensable knowledge of the other national cultural community, and its lingua-cultural background is recognized in the specific national cultural mentality. Lacunae, culturally marked lexical units, are considered as the main difficulty for rendering from one language into another. And under lacunae vocabulary, we understand folk lexical units that have no verbal equivalents in a certain lingua culture, or lexical units expressing this concept. The definition implies that the main lacunae vocabulary complexity is its untranslatability, which results in a process of semantic presentation of these lexical units. Thus, in order to demonstrate the meaning gaps, translators need to think carefully on the semantization techniques. The specific ways of such culturally marked lexical unit translation can be reviewed through figurative categories used in folk vocabulary, for example, metaphors, similes, connotation. In case of translation with the absence of translation equivalence, that is when in the target lingua culture the corresponding concept or linguistic sign with a similar tradition of use doesn't exist, it is practically impossible to establish the relationship of the folklore nomination with its translation equivalents. In this regard, we should speak of asymmetry or homology, as it is called. As to the translation techniques, we may consider the follows. The replacement of the source word or phrase by the corresponding equivalent of the target language, the interpretation in which, in addition to the equivalent in the target language, translators give the information about the coincidence in the cultural component of meaning. The translation of the great amount of the Lacunar lexicon is frequently based on the methods of transcription and transliteration, as well as by means of the semantic translation or modeling words as constructions of the foreign patterns. For example, it is used when we translate personal names, geographical names, mythological concepts, and so on. We can give the example of the translation I've found now in those fairy tales of the 19th century, that one of the Ukrainian mythological creatures, Och, was translated into English as "oh," as an exclamation, but I'll deal with the example a bit further. In case of semantic translation, the lexical units of the target language are used, but such equivalents have only the close translational correspondence of meaning with the absence of conceptual content. In this regard, the main interlanguage and intercultural complications caused by the translations on micro and macro levels have been noted. For example, one of the mythological creatures, Ukrainian mythological creatures, Mavka, was translated as a water nymph, water nixie. Mm-hmm. Here are language complications on the lexical level arise due to mismatch between the meanings of words, lack of semantic differentiation, different pragmatic potential of words in target and source languages, the similar notion lack or absence of interlanguage correspondences. For example, the pragmatic potential of folklore and mythological context in different languages is different, and the words having the equivalence in source and target languages have different associative realities. For example, in Ukrainian we have піч, сидіти на печі. In English we have stove, to sit on the stove. Ukrainian pampushka was translated as cake, stodola klunya were translated as shed barn, bычок as ox. Pip, it's a distressful term for a priest. Ukrainian distressful term was translated as priest, simply as neutral priest. Shinok was translated as a tavern. Now I want to give some examples from the folk texts. For example, Ukrainian och, as I've mentioned, is translated as o. Och is an ancient Slavonic mythological creature, the ruler of the forest kingdom. He appears in the tale called Och and is described as a short old man, all green with a long beard. Appears out of nowhere on a stump after someone sitting on a tree. Stump exclaims the word "oh," "och," "oh." Och is presented as the ruler of the forest kingdom. In the English version of the tale, Och is described as a little old man, also wrinkled and puckered, and his beard was quite green and reached right down to his knee. In Ukrainian, "och" is an exclamation used for the expression of physical pain, suffering, fear, or a feeling of relief, and so on. In English, "och," "oh," is an exclamation used to express a range of emotions, including surprise, anger, disappointment, but mainly joy, or when reacting to a remark. So the target language notion is corresponding the source language word, not only in the form, but it is very close to the base concept here. Ukrainian word "mavki" is translated as "water nixies. А за наймичок у оха мавки такі зелені, як рута. And O had water nixies for 7 mates, and they were all as green as Ryu. Mavka is a fairy forest creature in the image of a beautiful naked girl with long flowing hair. Mainly, it can be compared with a wood nymph. Nixie, the English Nixie, is a water spirit, a common water spirit of a Germanic mythology. She usually appears in forms of other creatures. So the form, the Ukrainian cultural concept, doesn't correspond to the English one. Ukrainian word "chort" is generally rendered by devil. Chort is considered to be a demon or of total evil, with horns, hooves, skinny tail, and a pig face in our Slavic mythology. He is the son of the Slavic god Chernobog and goddess Mara. In Ukraine, he is also known as Didko, Irod, and Kutsei. In folk Christianity, he is considered the miner of Satan. In English, he is associated, in English version of those fairy tales, he is associated with the devil. There was one more peculiar, interesting moment when I found a fairy tale called Ivan and Nicholas. One of the dialect names for British dialect names for the devil is Old Nick. So, and in Ukrainian lingua culture, Nicholas, it's Mykolai. It's associated with the saint. So we have the complete misidentification of the cultural concept. So I think I can finish at this. Just several spheres of such mixed, and that's all. So culturally marked vocabulary in those folk texts can mainly deal with everyday life, like food, beverage, that what I've named about pampushki and cakes in English. Then folk traditions, living conditions, interpersonal reactions and relations in the family, gender differentiations, traditions, customs, superstitions, national identity, etiquette and ritual behavior. So that's all.